We have an FCA, keen now to push a diversity agenda. As if diversity in the city is what matters. Well, when I worked here, it didn't matter what religion you were. It didn't matter where you came from. It didn't matter what class you were. It didn't matter what colour you were. When I worked in the city, it was based on, are you good enough?
Okay, so this DEI agenda, I think we need to talk about this because I think, like with many things, it's not been presented in the correct way.
So, without further ado, please let me introduce you to the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage.
Yeah, so to be honest, I wasn't here for this guy, if I'm being honest with you. Nigel Farage has just been gliding right now, just moving different, and yeah, he's having a good time. He's having a good time. I think his his social media presence, his moves have been good. And I think he's got that charisma, which obviously we see in Donald Trump as well. And I think he's the guy we're interested in, really. So this guy, yes, as I say, he's important in the sense that if the Reform Party come into power, he's going to be the guy that is basically running the economy, if that's the way you want to put it, as Chancellor. But actually, the sort of the person we're interested in, if you're thinking about the Reform Party, is Nigel Farage, and he was one of the main sort of proponents of Brexit as well, which is kind of where this momentum ultimately began. And it is aligned with their view as to what they expect the UK to look like post Brexit. So again, it's really Nigel Farage I'm actually interested in hearing about, more so than this this side quest of a character. Again, I'm not even sure what his name is, and that's my own fault, right? That's not meant to be a disrespect. It's just, I recognize his face, but I'm not really very clear as to who he is, and from a sort of personality perspective.
Zia, thank you, and good morning, everybody.
There you go. His name's Zia. I still don't know his surname, but that's his first name. So we're making progress.
Another depressing budget hoves into view, another tax-raising budget, another budget that doesn't have the courage, the guts to cut public spending. And I think the level of pessimism amongst businesses, amongst savers, amongst those that have assets of any kind has not been lower in modern times.
So I think for me, this is where I say he's got that charisma, and where I think he's doing a better job than his opponents. Arguably, maybe Zach is, and this is Zach Palancy of the Green Party, might be a potential rival in what I'm going to say here. But when you compare him to Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer, they are, as many people have described them, they're very, very sensible, right? They're kind of what you would expect of a British politician. Whilst Nigel Farage is very tapped into the sentiment and feelings of people, right? So most of what he says, just straight off the bat there, is very, very compelling. But in terms of something concrete you can assess, his position is very much the public sector is too big, right? He talks about that just there straight away. So initially when Zia, his would-be chancellor, spoke, he talked about foreign workers, or foreign immigrants or foreigners, let's say. I can't remember the exact term he used, but he was talking that people are other than UK citizens, right? And then again, the first thing Nigel Farage does is he wraps up these very salient and apt sentiment feelings around a position of public expenditure is too high. And his concern is, well, those with assets are very, very afraid and very, very worried. Those that are working are very, very afraid and very, very worried. And my concern and my feeling that is causing all of this is that essentially public, the UK Chancellor wasn't brave enough to address public spending. So it's literally a full counterattack of what Rachel Reeves was talking about, and her fiscal rules, right? So what she was saying is that she's going to prioritize the NHS. She's going to prioritize expenditure on defense. So this is security. And again, I would think about the police in that regard. And therefore, in order to do that, the heavy implication of what she was saying is that I need to raise taxes, because what I can't do, based on the on the current borrowing rates that I'm subject to from the market, is borrow more. And that's exactly what Zia talked about before introducing Nigel Farage. So that is her defense and her justification for raising taxes. Nigel Farage is literally saying the opposite. He's saying, actually, I don't believe in higher taxes. Equally, I don't think we should borrow more either. Therefore, I think you need to go more aggressive on public spend. So again, it comes back to exactly what I'm saying about your ideals, right? This is not necessarily a battle of who is right and who is wrong, because arguably Rachel Reeves' philosophy isn't working. Reformed philosophy is unproven. So ultimately, it's a matter of what you think the answer is, right? And who more closely aligns to what you think the answer is. But the answer has to lie within objective observation. It can't rely on emotion and it can't rely on sentiment. But I think what Reform are good at doing, as Trump is good at doing, is using sentiment to enhance their objective narratives.
I think for some years we've actually been living under an illusion. We've not been prepared to face up to just how much of an economic mess we're genuinely in. As we slip down the global league tables, we kid ourselves. Well, it's okay. We've got GDP growth. But there wouldn't have been any GDP growth over the course of the last few years if it wasn't for mass migration on a scale hitherto never even contemplated, and of course, excess government borrowing. That is all.
So that's interesting, because he acknowledges there has been growth, albeit 1%, according to Rachel Reeves, but that is technically growth. He's attributed that to borrowing, but also mass migration, right? So it's interesting, because one would think we do want to grow the economy. And if, based on what he's saying, we didn't have this mass migration, as well as the borrowing, but let's talk about mass migration, because borrowing is a normal thing governments will do, right? It is the way they access money, and then they use tax receipts to pay it back. So borrowing in itself is not a controversial thing. And it is a way you would expect of basically growing an economy, or even growing a business, right? If you seek finance from the bank, you are essentially borrowing to then invest in capital and then grow your business, other than an equity raise, for example. So that is a very common thing to do. What you wouldn't necessarily do is look for migration to drive economic growth. But he's acknowledged that that is one of the things that meant that as a country we could grow. And according to Rachel Reeves, we were one of the fastest growing G7 economies during this period, albeit being 1%, right? So it's interesting that this, in my mind, kind of contradicts their position around the benefits, economically anyway, of migration and the impact it's having. And I guess really where, if I interpret Reform's position to be fair to Nigel Farage, is that in his view, even though there may be growth in GDP because of migration, economic migration, let's say, what is it doing to British values, right? What impact is it having on the UK citizen that was here competing for that job before you had the economic migrant? And it's a topic of debate we are having in the US as well, not me, but what I'm observing in the US, I'm not American, and why there was a view around these sort of super talent visas. I think they're called H1B visas, and introducing a tax of $100,000 to basically disincentivize, widening your talent pool outside of your country, and basically looking for that talent within the country. But ultimately, again, what I'm going to say about this is that this is not an objective view as to what your economy should look like. It's a subjective view, right? If you take an objective view, in order to grow your business, it doesn't really matter where the talent comes from, right? that would be a capitalist view. It would be a free market view. But if you're taking the view that actually this country should be looking to employ UK citizens first, that is more of a protectionist view, right? And neither is right or wrong. Again, I do want to be very, very clear on this. It's just ideology, right? It's not academic. So the reason why I'm saying all of this is that when a person that is going to become a UK chancellor says the economy is failing because we've got, we've taken this sort of foreign outlook on building the economy as around foreigners, and then you have what the would-be prime minister elect saying actually we had growth because of mass migration. These are all just subjective views around what they think is going on. It's not objectively correct or incorrect until proven so, right? It's just, what do you think an economy should look like? How do you think that economy should be growing? Should it be more driven by free markets, capital, a capitalistic framework? Or is there a view around socialism and the role of, making sure that you have things like a welfare state, free healthcare, etc., which are more socialist leaning positions around how you view an economy and what a country should look like?
All that has kept GDP figures up. And indeed, I think we can argue very strongly that on an individual basis, mass migration has made the average Briton poorer. You take a year.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying here. So his view is, although GDP has gone up, the average individual person is still suffering. It's made them worse, even though the overall wealth of the country has actually gone up. And he's basically laying the blame at economic migrants. But again, I think, and I do want to be very, very clear on this point. It is one of many theories as to why UK nationals are suffering. Another theory might be that, for example, the reason why people are not receiving, enough to earn is because companies are not paying them enough, right? So, and I think you need to think about what I'm saying here, and think about the NHS, for example, actually, or any sort of public sector space, where salaries are typically not very, very high, and they don't allow you to basically rent or even buy a house or travel to work or eat because the cost of living is just so high, or you can't even live where you work, right? So if you're a teacher and you can't afford a house in the catchment area because the salary is so low, then what you tend to find is that there's a challenge recruiting for those jobs. And ultimately, those jobs need to be filled. And this is where you may rely on economic migrants to then do those jobs. So again, it's almost like, what is the cause? What is the effect, right? I think for me, I would argue the effect is that you've had more economic migration because the economic conditions of the country are failing the UK people. And again, there is a lot of talk around why that might actually be the case. So for me, I don't think that having more immigrants in the country in and itself is driving up the cost of living, right? Because most of these immigrants are doing jobs that are actually more low, that are low paid jobs, right? And then the ones that are coming in and doing the jobs that are more highly paid, typically these are immigrants that have basically been brought over by the companies that have established themselves or headquartered themselves here. And then they are choosing to widen their talent pool globally and say, actually, we don't care where you reside. We just want the best person, whatever they, deem to be the best person. So essentially, it's just a function of, free markets ultimately, right? And the question that I would have is, okay, if you think this is the issue, what can you do to incentivize companies to employ people in the country they are headquartered, if they are headquartered in the UK, what can you do to incentivize multinational companies that aren't headquartered here but employ people remotely, for example, to employ UK citizens? And what can you do to make the public sector jobs you do think are necessary, i.e. say that's police officers and doctors and nurses, I would say they are pretty essential, and teaching. What can you do to incentivize UK nationals to do those jobs instead of having to rely on economic migrants? And I think part of that question for me has to be, okay, what is the package offering? What is the salaries? Are you increasing those salaries? Are they keeping up with, the private sector? Because if they're not, what you're going to find is that UK nationals are probably going to look to work in the private sector and not do these jobs. They're either going to do these jobs abroad, where again there might be a lower tax regime, for example, and therefore there is no incentive for anybody in the UK to do these jobs that need to be done. So I think for me that it's a very difficult question to answer, and it's not just as easy to say, well, it's because of mass migration the UK people are suffering. It's not the complete answer, would be my position.
Like 2024, a record level of people coming into the country and GDP per capita falling. And of course, the productivity.
Yeah, and I think that is an important point, and it touches on what Rachel Reeves was talking about, right? So Rachel Reeves talked about falling productivity, worse productivity as an efficiency measure, right? And that's exactly what Nigel Farage is talking about here. And I think he's right to call that out. So the overall economy may have grown, but the production per capita may have actually fallen. It might still be an inefficient economy in that regard. And the reason why this is important is because it does set up his position quite nicely, actually, because the argument is there's too many people. So even though we've benefited from this increased production of over 1% or 1%, it's been at the cost of having more and more people who are less and less productive. That is his position right now. Again, we have to take him at face value and say, okay, that could be true, right? I've not seen the stats around that in terms of production per capita, but Rachel Reeves has said it's been less productive, and he is also saying it's been less productive in a different way, right? So she's taken it as hours worked, he's taken it as people working, which is kind of functionally the same thing. So I think it is right to call that out. But the problem with this is how he's going to potentially characterize it. He's going to characterize it as though immigrants that come in and work are in their nature less productive than UK citizens, right? Who are doing those same jobs. And again, there's nothing that will corroborate that position, right? It's just a hypothesis. A hypothesis. It's just an inference of what you think might be going on. And I think for me, that's the problem. It's when he starts and his party starts characterizing groups of people because of something that is happening. And I think for me, that's where I tend to have problems with some of what they're saying here.
Problem, well, there's nothing new there. We've been suffering from poor productivity going back for the best part of 20 years. We convinced ourselves that by importing masses of cheap, unskilled foreign labour, that somehow that would be good for our economy.
And that's exactly what I was saying, right? So he's classifying foreign labour as cheap, right? As inferior. And that is a subjective characterization of that labour. Also, it would also imply that those employing workers have lowered their standards, right? So it's kind of an indirect shot at business and business owners as well, right? And I think for me, again, this is where things start becoming problematic. Why is labour that has come from abroad inherently inferior, right? And if his only argument is that, well, it's because output has been less per capita, then I don't think that, again, that necessarily supports the argument that labour is inferior. Because, as I say, there's a lot of labor in this country that is not productive in an economic sense, right? So if you think about a teacher, again, I'll use these examples, and again, this is probably why they have a very cynical view of the public sector, to be fair to them. But if you do think about something like a teacher or a doctor or a police officer, what does their economic output or their GDP actually look like relative to someone that works in the city or someone that works in the service sector, for example, or the hospitality sector, right? You know, there will be economic benefit in terms of what they're doing, but it's more intangible. It's harder to capture. It's harder to measure. Also, when you think about the professional sector and you think about, and again, I think this is why per capita is probably a better measure than the one Rachel Reeves used, to be fair to Nigel Farage, when she talked about hours worked. Is, well, who is recording their hours worked, right? So if you work in the professional sector and you don't work for a legal firm or you don't work for, you know, an accountancy firm or anywhere where you're typically recording your hours, how, again, do we measure the efficiency of your output, right? And again, in many cases, when you think about a consultancy firm, outside of revenues, what is the total economic value of what they've delivered? For example, again, it would be indirectly revenues, but, you know, again, it's not very, very straightforward. So again, I think for me, and this is where he's actually quite skilled, in substance, what he's saying is true, but what he then does is he kind of injects his own personal theories about what he thinks is going on, i.e. his position is that foreign immigrants or, you know, economic immigrants are cheaper and essentially inferior and less productive than those in this country. And again, I've not seen any evidence that supports that, right? And I don't think the production per capita statistic supports that case, if I'm being honest.
It was good for the wage bills of big companies in the short term, but catastrophic when it came to training and education for our own workforce. And when it comes to the public sector, who still seem to be hooked on the idea that working from home somehow is good for productivity, well,
and again, this is another observation. That's a very subjective view about what he thinks is going on. Why does working from home in any sector, whether that be the private sector or the public sector, impact productivity, right? So you're not necessarily going to be less productive just because you work from home. You're not necessarily going to be less productive just because you weren't born in the UK. So I'm not sure why that is the root cause. So I think he's right to say, okay, in my opinion, this could be the issue, and we're going to do things to explore this. And ironically, this might be something where you say, okay, well, why don't you, commission a report, right? And actually look into this. Why don't you present some studies that show this? Why don't you quote or cite some studies that substantiate this? But again, it comes back to what I was saying before about, you need to connect the dots a little bit more, right? We can't rely on confirmation bias, which is what I think tends to happen sometimes here. You see something seems to fit that pattern, and therefore it must be true. But often what is being observed in many cases might be an incidental correlation between two things. And then what you're asserting as facts is actually just a position, just a theory, just a hypothesis that needs further inquiry, further investigation. So again, I'm not sure why he's laying remote working as a public sector phenomenon, because it does exist in the private sector and certainly the tech sector. I can assure you of that. You can speak to many developers around the world that don't work in an office, or their office is their home. And I'm not sure why any of those sectors would be less productive just because the majority of those workers are working from home. And actually, the irony here is that often that is one way of retaining UK talent. If you are headquartered in the UK and you're struggling to offer higher wages, but you say to your workers, look, you know what, you can go work in a lower tax jurisdiction and we will allow you to work remotely, that actually can potentially help the situation rather than negatively impact it. And again, there's no facts to what I'm just saying there, but what I'm saying is that it just depends on how you look at things. So I think, you just need to be very careful when you listen to any politician, where they take valid points and observations, but then they basically not sneak in, but they kind of then position in their own personal views and present that personal view as a factual statement.
See the disastrous results, and this is something that Danny Kruger on our behalf has started work on already.
Yeah, so who's Danny Kruger, right? So as I mentioned before, like, when you hear these kind of positions, you hope, right, they've referred to some of the things I've mentioned, like the ONS, the OBR, IFS, the National Audit Office, for example, in terms of some of these things as well, in terms of like auditing the public sector, in terms of how fiscally responsible they are. But when he says this random name, why is that more credible than anything else I've just described? So again, without those things, much of this will have to be considered opinion. And it might be correct, right? It might be on the money, but it is an opinion, right? And in an opinion we are free to agree with or disagree with.
But the one subject we really don't discuss, at least the Conservative and Labour parties don't discuss, is the level of national debt. In fact...
So that's not true. That was part of the justification Rachel Reeves gave ahead of time as to why we expect her to raise income taxes. And she, spoke ad nauseum about the markets, right? And in that video I covered, my question was, what is this market that we're all beholden to, right? This level of debt that, is drowning everything else, which it is, right? And she actually did give the answer in that video, even though I asked the question. And the answer was hedge funds, banks, and pensions, right? But that is one answer at one level. My question is deeper than that, right? It's, well, where do they get their money from? Hedge funds don't have their own money typically. They generate money and generate profits, but where did the initial capital come from? Where do pension funds get their money from? Where do banks get their money from, right? And if you listen to the likes of Gary Stevenson, he will tell you that the majority of their money come from high net worth individuals. It comes from individuals, right? And you will have some exposure to that by virtue of your pension if you have one. But essentially what's happening is you're riding on the coattails of bigger money, right? Big money. And you're paying a management fee for the privilege of doing so. So I think for me, this is why I find it odd that he's taken the view that the government doesn't talk about debt. They really do talk about debt. And it's often the justification for austerity. So I personally would disagree with this framing Nigel Farage is giving here.
Even last week, the leader of the Conservative Party was saying, in office, we cut the deficit for 14 years. We'll cut.
So they do talk about the debt, and they do talk about borrowing. So they may not talk about it implicitly, right? But they always talk about this. So I don't get why he thinks it's not something. I mean, unless his view is they don't talk about it enough, right? But again, that's a subjective position. That's his own personal position. It's not a factual thing. I think they talk about it a lot. He doesn't. We're free to disagree, but we're both in a space where we can't really prove that point, right? We can just have our opinion. So I just find it quite funny that on the one hand he's saying they don't talk about it enough, but then actually he's going on to talk about how it's been mentioned quite a lot in a different way, right? So that's interesting.
Cutting a deficit is a very different thing to cutting debt when you're still running borrowing certainly at peacetime levels, unlike anything ever seen before.
And that's correct, right? Deficits and debt are different things. So you can so a deficit is talking about your yearly position, right? Whilst your debt is like your overall position. And I think it's good he's clarified that point, to be fair to him. So coming back to his point about governments not talking about this enough, if this is the context he means, then I do agree with him, right? You do need to be a bit more precise with who you're speaking to about what you're saying, so that it's harder to spin, right? Because by doing what he's describing, i.e., by talking about debt and conflating it with deficits and surpluses and all this kind of stuff, governments can start spinning and misleading the electorate. And in a way, he's kind of calling that point out. And I do agree with him on that point. So I think that's fair to him in that regard.
They may try to wash their hands and run away from it, but our national debt increased by over 2.5 times during those 14 years. And now
I think this has been acknowledged though, right? So Rachel Reeves has acknowledged this and just made a load of excuses as to why it's not her fault. And even before she came into power, well, she got a position. She's not specifically in power, her party was. The Conservatives also did acknowledge this, right? So this is not a revelation. The difference is why he thinks it's happening and what he thinks the solution is. And much of his positioning and his Zaire, I think is the guy he's speaking about, positioning around this, is that they think they disagree with Labour's and the Tories' economic ideology, right? And that is what you would expect with parties, but parties do have ideology that drives their value system around how they think the economy should look. So that is to be expected. But the reason I'm saying this is just to be very, very clear on this, right? This is about ideology more than anything else so far, not about like being right or wrong. Reform are not more correct. They just have a different view and a different perspective on things. And as I say, if they want me personally to come to the conclusion that they are correct, then we need to see empirical evidence and data and logic that gets us to that place, right? Not feelings.
it's accelerating. Now it's accelerating in the most extraordinary way. The OBR predictions for the year going back just before the general election was that we'd borrow 77 billion in the...
And that's good. He's talking about the OBR. This is, again, what I'm talking about. Talk about the OBR. This is the Office of Budget Responsibility. Talk about the IFRS. Talk about the, central bank. Like, we want to know what they think because they are apolitical, right? I'm not interested in how you feel personally, if I'm being honest, other than the fact that you're an important person and your feelings guide whether or not I should be voting for you or not. But broadly speaking, if we're talking about facts, we need to talk about apolitical positions, right? So I'm glad he mentions the OBR, but often what you will find is they cherry pick the things that suit their argument and ignore conflicting information that may come out from the OBR. But I'm glad he's talking about the OBR there.
Yeah, that estimate is now 130 billion and rising with each and every month.
And again, what I want to talk about here as well is Rachel Reeves preemptively talked about this point when she talked about forecasts. Now, in my last video, I was quite critical on her when she talked about forecasts and what they are for and what they mean. And actually, maybe she was cleverer than I gave her credit for there, because this is essentially debunking here slightly what Nigel Farage is saying. He's saying that the outlook is worse, and he's referring to the OBR. What Rachel Reeves said was that OBR were considering the past, and that is not the way you think about the future, and the future is not set in stone. So she's presenting a more optimistic position than the OBR, whilst Nigel Farage is taking the OBR's position because it's unfavourable to the current chancellor, i.e. cherry picking in that regard. So I think it's interesting to see these parallels with what Rachel Reeves was saying and what Nigel Farage is saying. But myself personally, I more would be leaning to Nigel Farage's position, right? So my position is that I would agree that the forecast isn't necessarily the future, but it indicates you're on the wrong track, right? It indicates that you don't really have the economy fixed, as she was arguing in her own speech. And therefore, looking at it objectively, we would just have, I would personally be leaning towards Nigel Farage's position, that so far, the things that Labour have been doing have not led to a radical improvement in terms of the economic outlook.
Our debt has risen faster than any other comparable Western country. In fact, in the last 20 years, our debt GDP ratio is up by nearly 60%.
Okay, and that's also true, right? Well, I don't know about the specific statistics, but broadly speaking, what he's saying is true. Our debt has risen more so than other G7 companies. But again, Rachel Reeves actually did say this in her own speech. So again, it's not a revelation. And again, it was part of what he was attributing to economic growth that we saw over and above the G7 countries as well. So again, the point I'm raising here is that it's context. Context is really, really important. We also grew more than those other G7 economies, but yet we are more indebted. Yet arguably we may have more economic migrants, right? So ultimately it's a judgment, right? And how you weigh and balance up these different things, and then how you then view the outcome of those things. So I think for me, that's also important to note here, about what he's saying. And as I've mentioned before, borrowing is a valid way of growing a business or growing an economy if you deploy that capital, that investment, or that borrowing effectively. So again, it ties back to his point about production per capita and Rachel Reeves's point around production per hours worked. That is ultimately the question, right? If the country, sorry, or a company even, is not deploying borrowed funds or borrowed capital effectively, that is a bad thing. But my other view around this is that whether you do that or you don't, and whether or not you grow your economy or you don't, your tax collection engine also has to be as efficient. Because the reason you're trying to grow your economy from a government's perspective is to pay back the initial borrowing. And if you can't efficiently collect the additional tax on the additional wealth, then you're not going to be able to as quickly pay down the borrowing. And I think this is the part of the formula that Reform are just not focused on. They're not focused on the tax side of this equation at all. If anything, their view is there should be less tax as a philosophical, ideological position, right? And again, that's what I'm trying to stress here. What I'm saying is my own ideology. What he is saying is his own ideology, right? But my own view is that much of what he's saying is correct, but it also needs to consider other things. And the answer isn't the public sector has got, on its own anyway, the public sector is too massive, and or there are too many economic migrants.
We are doing worse on debt than any of our competitors, and that includes Eurozone countries who are in other deep, deep trouble. Our debt repayments are over 100 billion a year. They're over the level of our defence budget, and the markets are getting nervy. We've seen this with 10 and 30-year gilt yields. In fact,
And again, this is another question I raised as well. The markets are getting nervy. But I think it's important for you, anyone watching this, to try and understand who that market is, right? And the answer isn't, well, the answer is banks, hedge funds, pensions, but really understand where they're getting their money from and who they serve, right? I think that's a question you need to ask for yourself. I have my own view on this, which I've given. And essentially, as I mentioned before, it's essentially high net worth individuals with much of the world's assets. But I think you do need to form your own view around this, because this context is really, really important. Governments must work for the electorate, and the frameworks and the governance around this optically as well as actually must support that position, right? Whilst if you are a government that is basically indirectly prioritizing the market and market objectives over national objectives, then for me there is an issue there, right? Because you are accountable to those that you govern, not those you borrow from. If you are a government, right? If you're a business, that's a different dynamic. But if you are a country, your first and most important stakeholder is the electorate, and the markets must therefore serve the electorate.
I think my own view is that in 2 budgets' time, the markets will actually force the Chancellor into what will be a genuine austerity budget, at which point the left in the Labour Party won't buy it, and it's why I still stand by my prediction that there will be a general election caused by economic collapse that will happen in 2027.
And that could be true, right? Because as I say, the markets have the power to do this if we are too indebted to them. It's the same with any dynamic, right? If you borrow too much from a party, they have that leverage over you. And therefore they will be able to force you to liquidate your business, for example, if you borrow too much from the bank. So that is true what he's saying. But as I say, my own position around this would be, well, where does tax receipts come into that equation? And how could that mitigate that risk, that doomsday scenario he's describing, right? And that's why I think for me, tax, as well as everything else he and other politicians are describing, has to be part of that equation, and how you collect more taxes. Because I think as much as I don't want to see income taxes rise, I do think tax as a whole actually do need to increase. It's just where does it come from? And that's ultimately where the challenge is going to be for Rachel Reeves when she announces the budget, right? I do agree with her assessment, essentially, that taxes do need to increase. And the question will be where it comes from. But Reform's own position is that increase in taxes is not part of the answer to this challenge he's outlining. That is not their position. So again, I think it's important we understand ideologically we can get it, philosophically we can get it. Okay, we don't think high taxes is good. We want to see more money in people's pockets. But then I think he does need to, in a sense, explain how this will all be funded, and therefore what the ultimate impact will be to some of the things we rely on that are tax funded.
And just look at the pace, the rapid pace that we continue to deindustrialize. It's all going. Chemicals, refining, cement, heavy engineering, steel. We're losing literally all of it. Cars, and China, the beneficiary in almost every single sector.
Yeah, and that's true. So, and this has been the issue in terms of, I would say, the North, and also the West, where, again, a lot of these industries were really, really important historically. And the UK historically had been a global powerhouse in terms of these sectors as well. But this has been happening for a very, very, very long time. This is not a new phenomenon. And actually, my own position on this is that it is a function of capitalism, right? And again, it's an ideological position, again, to be very, very clear. Because the way this was being positioned was that by outsourcing, products would be cheaper for the benefit of UK nationals, for example, right? So if you could take that manufacturing and energy production is the thing they're calling out here specifically, outsource that where the workers are cheaper, and again, because they're subject to local workers' laws and local cost of living, say if you think about China at that particular point in time. Therefore, what companies could then do was offer lower prices to their customers in, say, Western economies, whilst maintaining their margins and providing shareholder return. But what people soon discovered was that essentially what was happening was that a lot of these companies just want to increase their margin, and then were leveraging their monopolistic positions over, you know, their customers, say in the UK, when you think about energy, for example, or your water or things like this, essential services where you can't choose your provider. So I think for me, it's kind of like, trying to have your cake and eat it, right? If you're a proponent of free markets and you're a proponent of capitalism, then this is a natural consequence of these things, right? Capital just goes where it goes. It doesn't really care about things like, cultural values or, identity politics or, protectionism. So, I do agree with him, but ultimately I feel like it's kind of been co-signed, sorry, by economists and politicians that are pushing, I would argue, a Thatcherite position around, well, we believe in free markets, and it's kind of like, well, that's just one of the consequences of that, I would say.
Why? Because for ideological reasons, we have chosen to have the most expensive industrial energy prices in the world.
Okay, that's a straw man position, right? So that's deliberately misrepresenting the reasons why this would happen. There's no government that would act unless they were corrupt, right? And that would be something, again, we can suspect, let's say, but we can't prove, and therefore it's just speculation, right? So unless they were corrupt and they had some skin in the game, why would they want higher energy prices, knowing it's something that would affect adversely their ability to be re-elected, right? It's not a choice you would make. It'd be an unintended, unforeseen consequence, I would argue, and it would argue to incompetence. And if I was him, that would be the argument I'd be making. I'd be making the argument of incompetence, not deliberately choosing something like this. So again, I'm not sure how he's drawn that conclusion or why he needs to strawman a position or a policy or a choice a predecessor made, because in my mind it actually undermines his own argument.
As for benefits, well, the bill this year has ballooned to over 300 billion. That is more than the cost of the National Health Service and Defence added up together.
So I don't know if that's true, but what I do know that is true is that, expenditure on things like benefit and the NHS has increased, and it is the majority of public expenditure. So broadly speaking, in substance, what he's saying is correct, but whether it's more than defense or other things, I don't know. That's the bit I'd probably have to check. But broadly speaking, what he's saying is actually correct.
So things aren't happening, and work isn't even paying. Our million lowest paid workers would all be better off if they claimed to have mild anxiety.
Okay, so again, this is another example of something that I would agree with, but then interjecting with his own personal opinion, which is unsubstantiated, right? So I would argue that the British contracts, the American dream, can no longer be honoured, right? In the majority of cases, I don't think, when you consider the cost of living and the level of income tax, that it pays in the same way to work, right? And it can become very, very challenging for people to think about working in this country and having hopes for, buying their own property, having children at a young age, if that's what they want, right? I'm not saying everybody wants this, but it's kind of what you think typically people aspire to. And this is why, again, you have to think about that in the context on this reliance on cheap foreign imports, right? I.e., workers coming from abroad and then taking their chances with these jobs that fundamentally don't pay enough. But also the fact that even these people on doing these jobs then also rely on supplementary benefits to make sure they can meet their day-to-day spending needs, right? So I do agree with that. But where I disagree is where he talks about the fact that the reason people are doing this is because they're giving up, and therefore they're looking to seek, a diagnosis of mild anxiety. That's just his own personal speculative opinion as to what is going on. And again, as he did earlier with some of the other observations he made, he needs to ideally refer to some studies that substantiates that position. Just saying it on its own without that context, to me, can only be interpreted as his own personal feelings. And again, you would hope that when considering an economic position or a vision of the country, it's not entirely led by what I would probably argue is prejudicial views of those that don't work. I.e., the assumption is that they're being lazy and they're slacking off, and then they're using a loophole such as mild anxiety, which again is an emotive, subjective assessment of someone's level of anxiety, to then skive off work.
That is the level of mess we're in. One of my own great frustrations is that Brexit has been squandered.
And I think for me, again, this is another criticism I would have of Nigel Farage, but not just him, Boris Johnson as well, and those that were advocately pushing for Brexit, but didn't present any real actionable vision of what Brexit should look like or how it should be executed, right? So I can't remember who came into Theresa May. Was it Theresa May? Yeah. So when Brexit happened, I think David Cameron resigned, and Tories were in power at the time. And then basically there was like this, I can't remember what you call it, but basically they then had to decide who the new leader would be. And basically the only person that really put themselves out there was Theresa May. None of these other people were anywhere to be found. And then she then squandered it. And then Boris Johnson sort of just came in, at the 11th hour and then did it. He just executed Brexit, and then it was kind of just left there. And I didn't really hear anything from the likes of Nigel Farage, or even Boris Johnson before Theresa May took office, to actually clearly outline the post-Brexit plan. So for me, it's kind of a case of should have, could have, would have. If I was there, I would have done this. If I was there, I would have knocked that guy out. And but thank goodness, he's lucky for him I wasn't there. It's kind of that kind of attitude, right? And for me, I have to look at it quite cynically, right? The reality when it comes to Brexit, I think we just need to draw a line in the sand in every direction. I don't really want to hear about what it could have been, what it should have been, why it's messed everything up. We are now outside Europe. The focus has to be forward looking. And I'm sorry, but it's kind of too late now to be frustrated from your perspective about, how we squandered Brexit. Because as I say, I don't think anybody was clear as to what, the post-Brexit world would actually look like from an executional point of view, in terms of, okay, what was next?
Opportunity to sensibly deregulate, the opportunity to become competitive globally, all of that has been squandered. And
Okay, so the opportunity to deregulate, I think for me is interesting, because that's not been squandered. You can deregulate at any time. It depends what you think deregulation looks like. But I guess in my mind, the deregulation is basically saying, okay, we repeal many of the EU laws. We have less laws and less restrictions to, let's say, doing business or doing anything, right? That's what deregulation means. But again, that's just a philosophical, ideological view as to what it takes to grow an economy, right? Deregulation in itself is not necessarily on its own going to grow an economy, because it relies on other things being in place as well, right? So for me, I'm not sure why we've squandered the chance to deregulate, because we can always deregulate at any time. But then the other thing to consider here as well, which I think is really important, is that the UK isn't an economic island. It can't unilaterally dictate it never could at any time, right? No. I mean, the US is probably the closest to the country that can kind of do this, but generally speaking, countries can't unilaterally, without consequence, set regulatory or legal frameworks if they want to participate in certain markets, right? So if you want to participate in the EU market and trade with the EU, whether you're inside the EU or outside the EU, there will have to be some agreement on certain things, and the UK would have to concede certain things as part of any trade deals, right? And yes, you may have a feeling of more autonomy around that, but ultimately, the EU market is a massive market, and chances are you will have to concede certain things anyway. So again, really what this is about is a matter of perspective and ideology again. And I know I've said this a lot throughout this reaction. But to me, my challenge here is I did not hear a clear view as to what post-Brexit would look like in terms of policies. Deregulation is a very broad statement. What does that really mean? What are the sort of the finer details of deregulation, and what economy can we look at that is rapidly growing as a result of deregulation? Again, it would be good to see an example of this, that he can show us, reference a jurisdiction, reference a country, where you've got this hyper growth economically, and the reason is because they deregulated, and wealth was distributed equitably, i.e. there wasn't this massive wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots. Show me that, and then I can sort of understand a bit more why deregulation is the answer.
First thing is that regulations and the way regulators behave with British business is now worse than it was at the time of the Brexit referendum vote, and I apply that with knowledge from everything through the financial services industry to the fishing industry.
So why is it worse? So again, this is my point here. It's like, what does worse mean, right? And if I was to guess, I would say he thinks worse means it's more costlier to do business. It might be harder to compete if people are subject to different levels of regulation, and it basically deters investment, right? That's probably based on what he said so far, and how I think reform view things. That would be the case. And again, this could be true, right? Anything you do that increases bureaucracy and hurdles and barriers to entry into any market will have that impact. But also the flip side of that is that it also can give market confidence, right? That's where much of this regulation comes from. It gives parties the confidence to trade. And it's two sides of the same coin, right? Regulation is around managing risk somewhat and providing confidence and managing optics, perceptions. And then deregulation removes those barriers. So it means capital can move around more efficiently, but it opens up the door to things that create lack of confidence in those markets, i.e. corruption. Right? That's a classic example of something that is deregulation or market manipulation, as we saw in the Enron era, for example, which is where Sarbanes-Oxley came from. So again, it's not a straightforward answer. And I think for me, again, we have to be careful when people present solutions as though they're really, really simple, and take facts and valid observations, but do not properly contextualize them, because they position it in a way that confirms their own ideology, and their own ideology by implicitly is biased. My own ideology, my position is also biased, right? So I'm no better or worse than Nigel Farage in that regard, but I do want to be very, very open about these things, and that is why your own opinion is the most important opinion, and why you need to try to be as objective as possible before forming your own opinion, and also being open to the idea that your opinion can shift and evolve, because you will never have the full facts. I will never have the full facts, right? But right now, much of what he's saying is driven by sentiment. That's the sort of assessment I'm making so far.
Now, we believe that the fundamental problem behind so much of this, and yes, of course, there are global trends. Yes, of course, these things are factors, but that there is a fundamental problem at the heart of the way this country is run. It's the people that are actually doing it. We're run by a group of human rights lawyers, not entrepreneurs.
Okay, so this is the incompetence fallacy we've heard about before, and it was something when I covered the why we can't tax wealth discussion, or wealth tax discussion, Daniel Priestley had on LBC, and it's something I've heard anecdotally as well, about the fact that, you know, in government we don't have the right people, we don't attract the right people. You know, part of the reason is we don't pay them enough. They've never run a business before. For me, it is a fallacy, and again, it's my own personal view. And the reason I say that is for many reasons, right? But I'll talk about the main ones. Firstly, it's not how government is designed, right? It's not intended that the person in that role, you know, perversely is actually qualified. Like, what course do you take to be prime minister, or you know, a chancellor, or, you know, secretary of defense, or home secretary? Like, whatever that role looked like last year is not going to be, you know, even last week is not going to be the role it looks like this week, right? And it comes back to my point around predicting the unpredictable, and scenario analysis that government should be considering when putting together a budget. Secondly, you know, I guess some may argue, okay, well, if you are a chancellor, you should have, you know, economic qualifications, you should have financial qualifications. And I would say that that's nice. That would be good. But what I would actually expect is that you surround yourself with those individuals, actually, and you are competent enough and reasonable enough to take that knowledge and consider the national interests, as well as, you know, to some degree, the interests of your own, you know. So essentially, it's by design that these people are not necessarily going to be entrepreneurs. Secondly, a country is not a business, right? And I do really, and I know that sounds like a very basic argument, but it's a very, in my view, valid argument, because a business is essentially there to enrich the shareholders of that business. So, and the shareholders will be a smaller population than its customer base typically, right? It may not be, but typically it will be, right? That's its only job. Its only job, I mean, it's meant to like comply and play by the rules and move in accordance with compliance frameworks, but its main job is simply to incentivize the transfer of wealth from a larger population to a smaller population, and that will be a transfer of assets and desired resources. So essentially, the business is there to serve the people at the top. What's a country is a bottom-up type of governance, by virtue of the fact one citizen, one vote. So it serves the interests of those at the bottom, so to speak, right? It serves the electorate. So that is the dynamic you always have to consider when you think about who should be running the country, right? And when you think about an economic model, again, when you're just trying to basically overlap a commercial model over the country's books, does that make a lot of sense, considering the relationship between a shareholder and the business, where the shareholder has put their own money into that business, and therefore that business should serve their interests, versus the relationship between the electorate and the government, where the majority of the money that that government has is coming from the electorate, right?
Virtually nobody on the front bench has ever taken a risk, ever borrowed money, ever set up a business.
He can't know that's true, right? So setting up a business is not the only way of taking risk. You understand? They may have invested in a business, right? Even if they haven't set up a business. They may have taken a risk with their own personal careers. You know, they may be day traders for all he knows. Like, what does he know about what they're doing, right? Why is this skill set specific to him or the Reform Party, right? And is lacking in all the other parties. And to some degree, coming back to my initial point, why do we even care if they're surrounded by the relevant experts and they are knowledgeable, competent people, or competent enough, I should say, right? So I'm not sure why any of this matters too much, actually, but that's just my own personal feeling. It doesn't really matter to me that much.
Ever had to meet that monthly or weekly, depending what you do, payroll? There is no understanding at all. The disconnect between the conversations in Westminster and, frankly, in much of the media too, and what is happening in the real economy is a gaping chasm.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with the perception, right? So the perception, to me, I would agree with. But my own view is that there's nothing telling me that any politician doesn't understand the real world. They don't understand sufficiently anyway businesses and how businesses operate. Like, it's not that deep is what I'm trying to say. And yes, unfortunately for Labour, they've fallen foul with rules around selling their second home and dealing with the tax there. Unfortunately, the Chancellor's fallen foul of applying for the correct rental license, for example. So again, it doesn't help the case of debunking what Nigel Farage is saying here. But my own view around all of this is that, again, broadly speaking, understanding what a business is and what regulation should look like, broadly speaking, is not that hard. It's not that deep. And I would argue that these people know well enough what to do. And what I think is actually happening is that they are not really fully considering the interests of the electorate, right? Where they focus their attention is what is misaligned. And one may even say, is there a level of conflict or corruption around what they know they should do versus what they actually can do, right? If the view is we need to keep the markets happy, can that or does that conflict with what we need to do for the electorate, right? And if you're in that bind, if you're in that situation where you are conflicted, what do you do? And the outcome of what you do might appear to be incompetent, when actually it's just a reflection of the fact I should say, that your master is actually not the electorate, it's, say, the markets, it's something else.
Well, I have to tell you, it's even worse when you think about who runs the departments. Oh, let's put a minister in charge of railways, shall we? They can oversee HS2. They've never worked in railways. They've no knowledge of railways. They haven't got a clue what they're doing. And yet, we managed to have 18 rail ministers in the space of 14 years. And this applies in department after department. People whose only qualification is to be a member of Parliament.
And I agree that the perception isn't great, but I would also argue that is a function of how politics works, right? That's a deeper issue and challenges like the British idea of democracy, right? So there's been a lot about the erosion of British values, but this is actually a reflection, in my view, of British values, right? This is the way, for a long time, governance has happened. If you think about before government, you had kings, you had queens, right? Nobody elected them. What qualifications did they have? They just assumed office, so to speak, right? And then you then said, okay, well, we're not happy with that. Let's have a revolution, and we're now going to have a democracy. But ultimately, democracies are just delegated powers, right? So you just vote for someone, and then they're kind of free to kind of do what they want, vote in different people to do different things. It's like it's understood. Like, you vote for parties, not for people. You vote for ideology and values, not competence, if that makes sense. And I think that's why understanding their ideology is important, but the context is also important, right? Ideology isn't facts. It's just how you see the world, how it's your outlook, and it changes all the time. So the fact that he's criticizing politicians for not being competent, to me, is like he's actually criticizing the political system in its entirety, of which he's operating under. So that's an interesting position, I would see, and it would imply that he wants to reform it in some way, hence the name, I guess. But he wants to change that, And I think that's something people need to think about, actually. And maybe there is an appetite for that change, right? I don't know.
As if that's enough. As if that's enough to give a lead, to give a guide over all the things that really matter in our life. Now, if we had a parliament made up of more experienced people from a broader range of life, that might be okay.
And that's true. I think government should be more representative, but there's a limit, right, as to what is possible. But I do agree with him in principle that the government should be more representative.
But the current convention that both parties stick with just simply doesn't work.
And again, I do want to be clear here. This convention that he's talking about isn't a political party thing. It's just a British politics thing, right? So it's not the Tories saying this is how it needs to be, or Labour saying how it needs to be, or Reform, or anybody. It's just how it is now. And if you want to change that, that's fine. But you can't lay the blame for that on any particular party, in my view, right? It's just the way politics is.
In fact, frankly, you think about it, it really is a farce, isn't it? You're put in charge of a big department, and then after 14 months, when you've just about got your feet under the table, Keir Starmer, or whoever else it might be, decides to reshuffle you.
That's just politics. Again, it's just the nature of the beast. So yes, it's ridiculous, but it's not a criticism specifically for Labour, if I'm being honest with you. And this is why, again, nuance and perspective and context is always important. Many things can be true at once. It is ridiculous, but it is what it is. And it's not specifically a Labour problem. You know, again, you have to think about this more generally, right? Every time a Reform Party member has done something stupid or said something stupid, or they've kind of missed the Overton window, so to speak, of what is acceptable to talk about, we have seen those members be replaced or disavowed or removed, right? So it has been something Reform have done themselves for whatever reason, right? And it's within the rights of a party to do that because the electorate has voted for the party, not the individual. They assume as collectively the party is competent and that they're competent enough and that authority is delegated in order for them to manage their house and put it in order to make sure the things that need to happen and the people are in the right positions, right? In the same way you give your money to a company, you don't then go in and start auditing that company to make sure, is the person they've chosen to be CFO qualified and competent? Is their CEO, adequately experienced? And are they hiring the right tech staff? Where are they hiring them? Do they have anti-slavery laws in place or things like that? Like, that's not really how it works, right? You just give them the money. You kind of do an assessment, you do your due diligence, but thereafter they're kind of free to operate as they wish. So it's kind of the same in that regard. So I think for me, again, it's just interesting the way he's contextualizing it, because for me, I would take that same information, but contextualize it in a completely different way.
And so my promise is that Reform will not just think differently, but Reform will do differently.
And I think for me, this is important. What will they do differently, right? That is really, really important. Because right now, you're kind of constrained by how politics works. And you're also free, as I've mentioned before, within those constraints to reshuffle your bench accordingly for any reason, right? So if they're going to do something differently, what ensures they're going to have to do something differently or will do something differently? Why can we believe that is really what I want to understand.
We will sweep away these outdated conventions. We will become the most pro-business, pro-entrepreneurship government that has been seen in this country in modern times.
And again, this is also important, right? Because this speaks of his ideology and it comes back to his vision of how the British economy should be driven, right? And what he's doing is he's placing and pedestalizing entrepreneurs and businesses, right? It's a very capitalistic ideology, pro-capitalism, pro-free markets. And And coming back to his point around doing things differently, what does that mean for governing, right? So that is something else to just have in the back of your mind here. What does that mean in terms of addressing this perceived incompetence fallacy?
We'll bring into government, as advisors or ministers, people with real business expertise in their own sector. And we will signal what we hope and believe and what we know we need to be a change of attitude in this country.
Okay, so this is one answer to that question. They're going to bring in qualified, presumably private sector individuals, essentially to help govern. And I think this is what we saw with a couple of the councils, or the, I can't remember which jurisdictions or seats they won, where they looked to bring in some consultants to find savings. It's something Rachel Reeves talked about, right? So in her pre-budget speech, where again, what we would expect to see is examples of this excellence he's describing in the boroughs or the seats or the areas that they are currently governing. And as yet, we haven't seen that example, right, of this working, this vision he's describing. And I think for me, it comes back to what I say about regulation and optics, right? Presumably, these private sector individuals are not going to do it for free, right? So, and they're not elected, and that's another key point, right? So when you elect a politician, they can't earn more money necessarily because they do their job more effectively. They can't earn more money, or they can't necessarily very easily delegate their responsibilities to somebody more competent in the private sector, right? So if they're now changing things where they're saying actually they're going to be working more closely in government with companies in the private sector, for me, you have to really think about the optics of that, because it's going to be very interesting to see which companies and which businesses win those contracts, what they are paid, are they paid above what you would consider normal market rates, the relationships between those politicians and those businesses, as we've seen in the US. Suddenly what you find is the senator's family suddenly start all these businesses and become very, very wealthy. We saw this with Tony Blair's son as well, where suddenly, he became very, very wealthy. And also when we had the pandemic, a lot of businesses and consultants were engaged, with respect to PPP and advisory services, who had connections with the Prime Minister. So the optics have to be thought about, I think, very, very, very carefully. And I think for me, also what you have to think about is things like insider trading as well, where you find that businesses that are very closely connected to government and government policy are able to gain a competitive advantage by that connection and that relationship in setting policy, as well as that proximity to the seats of power. So this is why I talk about this balance between deregulation and capital movement, so to speak, and investment, versus a high regulatory country or jurisdiction where, again, it's less efficient, but there's more safeguards that then manage this perception issue around potential corruption or collusion between parties that should be interested, i.e. the government that should be interested in doing what's right for the electorate, versus a business whose main concern is looking after its shareholders.
A change of attitude towards hard work, a change of attitude towards making money.
So again, this ties back to his point around people not working in the UK. So he talks about two things. He talks about the jobs that are there, they're being outcompeted for by cheap foreign labor. He's also saying that employment figures are down because people are essentially choosing not to work and seeking a sort of mild anxiety diagnosis to avoid that. So he's characterizing people that are not in work, and he's characterizing people that come to this country to work. He's placing a persona on these people, which is why he's talking about changing the attitudes to work. And I think for me, again, I want to be very, very clear about this. This is not a factual position. It's his own philosophy. It's his own feelings. It's his own view of this particular demographic. There's nothing that substantiates really what he's saying here. And your views may align with this, it may not. But as I say, I just want to be very, very clear. These are not factual things. And it does slightly concern me that this is part of his thinking when thinking about reforming the economy and reforming how this country is governed.
A change of attitude towards success. And I would like to think this would begin in our schools, that we'd have more national champions, that we'd take people who'd come from nothing and become successes and make them heroes.
And again, this is what I'm talking about. So in his view, and this is his own view, the people that should be held up in society are entrepreneurs, right? Those are the heroes, right? And again, just think about that, right? Think about the people that had the biggest impacts on your own life. Think about a lot of the people that have started and led charities, for example. Think about Doctors Without Borders. People that could be, earning a lot of money. Somewhere like the UK, and a lot of them will be, UK medical professionals. Just think about what he's saying there, right? And there's nothing wrong in a way, objectively, with what he's saying. But what I'm really trying to get to the point here is that it's a very narrow view and a very personal view about what should be celebrated, and it's not one that actually represents representation. It doesn't take into account a different view about what would inspire young people, right? So yes, we should have entrepreneurs come to schools and talk to students and engage them and say, look, you know what, if you're struggling at school, you can still start a business, you can still achieve, this is how the capital markets work, etc., etc. But equally, we should also be talking about people outside of the entrepreneurial space as well and say, well, look, if that doesn't align with your views, and you have a different view about what you want to achieve in your life, I'm this person that's an example of that thing as well, right? So for me, that's the thing I find, again, slightly disappointing, is that so much of what he says seems to just be his own personal convictions. It doesn't seem to be considering or providing a vision of something the whole country can get behind. And for me, that is something governments ideally should be thinking about, right? And this is my concern with the US situation. It's like the US president should have a vision for the entire country, not just for the Republicans.
And role models for younger people to follow, because believe me, that is very, very badly needed indeed.
Yes, it is needed, but other heroes are needed as well.
And perhaps it's appropriate that this speech is being given in this magnificent old banking hall right here in the heart of the city of London. Now,
I think it's very appropriate based on Reform's view of where their priorities lie. And I actually think it's very appropriate for many chances, actually, to be fair to Reform. It's not just Reform. And that's why I disagree with his position around the fact that they don't talk about borrowing enough. UK governments care very, very deeply and bend over backwards to keep the markets happy, and to look after their crown jewel, that is the City of London. So it doesn't matter whether this is a Reform Prime Minister, candidate, or any politician of any party, apart from maybe the Greens, I suppose. But broadly speaking, this would be a suitable environment for any governments we've ever had.
Place that I know incredibly well, having spent much of my working life here, and generations of my family before me.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about that point, actually. And when I talk about bias, because again, he talks about generations of his family working there. And that's interesting, that he talks about that. But let's carry on.
Worked here. It is a very special place because it symbolises what is still, despite everything, Britain's biggest industry. We never talk about it.
We do. I flatly reject that assertion. We talk all the time about the British economy. When you're talking about the British economy, we always talk about the service sector, and more specifically the financial service sector, and specifically the crown jewel of the British economy, the City of London. We always talk about it all the time. Everything that happens in this country serves the South, serves the city, all infrastructure investment. We talked about HS2 as well. Oh, we referenced it anyway in my last video when covering the Chancellor's response, Chancellor's pre-budget speech. Much of the infrastructure we saw in terms of the Elizabeth line and the Docklands Light Rail, the Olympics, I would argue, Wembley Stadium, all of that just built the serving infrastructure around the City of London, Canary Wharf. And as I mentioned, HS2 no longer will consider serving some of the northern regions that it was meant to, be able to service. So we talk about this a lot, but I think, as I say, it's just a subjective view. In my opinion, we talk about it a lot. In his opinion, not enough. But again, he is a child and an ancestor of the banking system. Like I said, he's got this generational link to the place. So in his view, clearly we need to talk about his people more.
Parliament really debates it. Financial services are Britain's biggest industry. But what sad decline we are.
And I guess my own view is that's good, but it'd be good if it wasn't the only thing that mattered so much. I think coming back to what he was talking about before, about the industrial sector and the decline of the industrial sector, I think for me that was nice to hear, in the sense that, that should also be factored into this as well, so that you have other jewels, economic jewels you can think about. So yes, I think it's well understood it's the biggest sector. It is the most important sector at the moment, and it's the sector that government predominantly focuses on, in my opinion.
Are currently in. We have an EU rule book that is almost entirely in place.
And whose fault is that, right? So, and also coming to the point around this, and maybe that's his point, right? Like, he's not happy with Labour and the Conservatives for keeping that EU rule book. But the reality is, if the City of London wants to trade with the EU, and that's the requirement of the EU, then what choice does the UK have, unless it turns its back on that market, right? Or negotiates. And maybe that's his point as well. Maybe he's saying, okay, I can go in there and negotiate a better deal where we're not, sort of held up by this, sort of restrictive regulation. But then one would argue, why would the EU agree to something that puts the UK at an advantage over them in terms of developing their own banking sectors? So again, it's easier said than done in many of these cases. And I think it ignores the realities of the fact that economically, the world is very interconnected, and concessions typically have to be made in order to enter into certain markets.
That is interpreted by massively overzealous regulation. The costs of doing business in London, the costs of doing business in our financial services industry are now simply too high.
In his opinion, right? So again, the cost of doing these things might be high, but typically these costs will be transferred to the end customer anyway, right? So that in itself is what it is. And again, it comes back to what I'm saying about what is the other side of that equation, right? So yes, it might be high, but it might be the price to pay to ensure there is market confidence, right? And there's, the right checks and balances. So is it a cost, or is it just something that enables us as investors, whether we're people that are buying bonds or buying gilts, or whether we're just retail investors, to have the confidence to invest in the nation, to invest in the banking system, and allow that banking system, in this case, to take advantage of favorable interest rates, because there is that level of confidence, right? So again, these are the kind of things that have to be kind of explained in some way. It's not enough to just simply say, in my opinion, the cost is too high. I just want it to be lower. Because it's the same argument as saying income tax is too high. I just want it to be lower. My position is that it is subjectively too high, but relative to those who do not earn an income but are still growing their wealth, it is too high. So that is the context in which I would give when arguing my own position as to say an income tax, for example, is too high.
And we're losing business to places all over the world. New York, the Far East, you name it. There is, of course, one booming sector here, though. That is HR and compliance. And Richard Tice and I were talking about this earlier. The FCA...
So Richard Tice, again, don't know who that is. Again, unless he explains who that is, I don't care.
now incredibly have 5,000 staff. It was 2,000 staff when I left the city just over 20 years ago.
And I think that's fine. I think it was talking about the FCA there, where they had 2,000, then it's ballooned to 5,000. But is the remit of the FCA the same, right? So whatever remit they had when they had 2,000, is it the same remit as 5,000? And I have to assume it is, which is why he's making this point. But unless we know that, we don't really know, right? Again, it's just an opinion. It's just his own view. You know, maybe 2,000 meant it was understaffed, right? Again, I don't know. All I know is it's gone up. And yes, in principle, we should argue, does it need to be that high? But was 2,000 in the first place too low, right? So unless he can debunk that argument, then I don't know where the validity is in his argument.
And still we carry on with our outdated practices. We still have stamp duty on share transactions and wonder why IPOs and stock trading in London is in such serious state.
So again, this talk about stamp duty and share transactions and why it's a problem. Again, who does that impact disproportionately, right? It impacts those with disposable income. It impacts those with, excess liquidity, let's call it. So this is people with a lot of cash that need to put their money somewhere. And therefore we're saying, okay, we have this stamp duty on shares, and therefore that's a deterrent to that investment. And again, I'm not sure I would agree with that necessarily. I would agree that it'd be better if there was no stamp duty, but I'm not sure with the fact that the stamp duty being there is reducing the level of investment. And I think when he talks about the IPO, that is something we have observed, which is why I've kind of not been happy about Rachel Reeves insisting that pension funds, for example, allocate capital to UK listed companies. Because again, to me, I want the freedom to invest where I see fit. I want my pension fund to reflect my own investment philosophy. And I want to see my investments typically in emerging markets and the biggest markets, i.e. the US, where there tends to be bigger returns. So the fact that there's less IPOs in the UK does impact that and make the situation worse. But again, I think one has to also consider, are there less IPOs in the UK simply because it is a smaller market, right? If you think about the level of investment that is possible and the level of retail investment, so this is people like me and you investing in these companies, if they're listed in the UK, do they receive as much money or much funding or as much exposure to, say, the US or the UAE or anywhere where there's just a lot more people or there's a lot more richer people, right? So part of the equation is, okay, how much people are being paid and what disposable income do they have to even invest? That's part of the equation. But the other part is just a function of the fact that it's just a smaller market potentially. So which is it, right? And his position is, well, there's just too much regulation and the stamp duty. Okay, that might be part of the answer. But I don't think it's the only answer. I think there's other things that need to be considered. And if he thinks that is the only answer, then I think we need to see, again, some research, not a conversation he had with a guy that I've never heard of, that substantiates that.
We have an FCA, keen now to push a diversity agenda. As if diversity in the city is what matters. Well, when I worked here, it didn't matter what religion you were. It didn't matter where you came from. It didn't matter what class you were. It didn't matter what colour you were. When I worked in the city, it was based on, are you good enough?
Okay, so this DEI agenda, I think we need to talk about this because I think, like with many things, it's not been presented in the correct way, right? And there's another point to consider here, right? Because I'm thinking about his generation of his own members of his family working in the banking system, right? He's got this generational legacy of bankers. It's like, is that just happened to be a meritocracy, right? Because that's what this is about, right? Is it a meritocracy? And what DEI is doing, right, is it's basically giving opportunities. It's not giving jobs. It's giving opportunities to people that would not necessarily have an opportunity for various reasons. And it might be that they didn't go to the right university. So that would apply to, for example, or it should apply to, say, a white working class male or female, for example. There's other working class demographics, there's working class black people, but I'm just saying in this example, a working class white male who didn't go to an Ivy League university. So they went to university, but they just couldn't get into an Ivy League one. And therefore, what DEI would say or require of some of these bigger sort of banks and hedge funds is that typically want to focus on Ivy League universities, for example, is say, okay, well, you've got 10 spots, but actually make it 15. And those other 15 should be like women and black people and white working class person, which is why if you look at the check boxes for recruitment forms, you'll see things about where did you go to school, what were your parents doing, et cetera, right? Trans people, etc. But then when it actually comes to selecting from that recruitment pool, the same standards should still apply. So if it ends up that the person they select comes from the Ivy League school that they always would have selected, that's absolutely fine. DEI is looking at the recruitment process. It's looking at, are you considering a diverse talent pool and assessing on that basis and being open-minded and then being transparent about your recruitment criteria. So it mitigates nepotism, right? It's a countermeasure to nepotism. And that's why they've looked at things like internships and making them paid. Because again, if you don't pay them, then typically the people that benefit from internships are the people that don't need the salary and the people with the connections. So when you hear a situation where you have, my son was a pilot, my daughter was a pilot, then their daughter was a pilot, and so on and so forth. This whole legacy of banking professionals, this whole legacy of golfers, the reason you're seeing that is because the opportunities are not available to others, and therefore the talent pool is restricted to those that can afford to coach and train their children into having the opportunity and exposure into those professions. But then at the same time, once they get in, they then have to prove that they are good enough. And this is substantiating Nigel Farage's point that you must be good enough. So the point I'm making is that diversity just opens doors. It just presents the door. You can walk through it, but if you are found wanting, it does not matter who you are going to get kicked out. So he and his ancestors were competent. They deserved to be there. But the reality is that they were not facing the same level of competition that they otherwise would have faced for those jobs if diversity, equality, and inclusion was something that was in effect. Because what they would have had to have done is compete with a wider talent pool, and the right person would still be the person that comes out on top. And if they were always going to be the right person, it doesn't change anything for them. It's as simple as that. But if it does, and you find, instead it's this other person from that other demographic that gets the job, it's not a token hire. They deserve to be there.
It was based on being a meritocracy. And that coincided, I think, with London being at the most dominant position in financial services that it's been certainly
And again, this is important there because the language here is really, really important. So you have to remember what he talked about cheap foreign work and the fact that DEI has changed things and had this adverse impact on their competitiveness as, you know, being considered, you know, the best banking sector. So what he's arguing implicitly is that the standards have gone down. And what I'm clearly explaining here is that the standards never change. The only thing that changes is who you're looking at to fill the spot. But the requirements of that particular job, that particular spot, never changes. And if the people in the diversity section are not good enough, you don't recruit them. You just need to have an audit trail and that transparency to show that you are not implementing nepotism or favoritism or discrimination. And yes, that is a cost on business. That is regulation, actually, right? But what it also does is it gives confidence. It gives confidence to say, okay, well, the recruitment process is fair, right? Without that, without DEI, I don't know if it's fair.